Hello everyone and welcome to a special COP28 webinar examining the role of communications professionals and corporate affairs directors around the world in the climate agenda. I'm Maya Pawinska-Sims, the EMEA editor of PRovoke Media, the global publication for the PR and communications industry, and I'll be moderating today's session. In the spirit of sustainability, the event being virtual is minimizing our collective carbon footprint and has been pulled together in a spirit of true collaboration and partnership. The session has been organized by APACD, that's the Asia Pacific Association of Communications Directors, who have co-organized the session. And while I'm in London, my panel is being graciously hosted from 3M's offices in Dubai, a stone's throw from the action, the politicians and the deal makers, and all the hustle and bustle of COP28. This webinar is also an extension of APACD's Sustainable Communications Programme, which for more than 5 years now has been collaborating with students and academics of Hong Kong University and Singapore Management University. And in true journalistic style, I have an exclusive for you. This session marks a brand new partnership between APACD, the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation, and global insights and advisory consultancy GlobeScan, who will be rolling out further initiatives together in 2024, creating a forum for further knowledge sharing, dialogue and purposeful communications around sustainability and climate issues. As you know, COP28 is taking a first ever global stocktake on the collective progress made towards meeting the climate action goals set in Paris in 2015. As corporate affairs and communications leaders, what does this significant political moment mean for our role and our organisations? Against a backdrop of global polycrisis, today we'll glean insights on the risks around reputation and our social licence to operate, the business of facing, as well as looking at our function's role in addressing the evolution of ESG, corporate activism and political populism. And crucially, how do we remain relevant as trusted advisors to senior executives communicating climate leadership and overcome or avoid allegations of greenwashing or CEO green hushing? To answer these questions and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of 4 people who are far more knowledgeable than me on all these areas. Before I introduce these guests, there will be time for Q&A at the end, so please do post your questions in the Q&A function on screen. There's a little button just at the top there you'll see. First of all, we're joined by Rupert Younger, Director of the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation at Oxford University Saïd Business School. Rupert, welcome.
Thank you.
Second, we have GlobeScan CEO and founder, Chris Coulter. Chris, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Maya. Hi.
Next, I'd like to welcome Amanda Yates, Senior Director of Global Sustainability at 3M. Amanda, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And finally, we have Sammy Joost, Global Communications Director at Bayer Crop Science. Sammy, welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Maya. Thank you.
Rupert, I'm going to kick off with you, if that's all right. Can you give us an overview of the role of corporate affairs and comms directors when we're thinking of the climate agenda and how this is changing and needs to change further?
So hello everyone. It's nice to see you, Maya, and to be here in Dubai. And I thought I'd just paint a bit of a picture, because to answer that question, I want to introduce this notion of hypercomplexity. If you, like us, like the 4 of us, have spent time in the last couple of days in and out of the green zone and the blue zone in Dubai, it's massive. This is a place where the green zone takes, I think it takes 25 minutes to get around it by bus. Walking between the different pavilions is an exercise in stamina, and it's incredibly hot. It's incredibly busy, but it's very vibrant. When you walk into these massive halls, you see companies, policymakers, you see NGOs, you see the media, you see a whole range of different people. The amazing costumes. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, but there are headdresses from all the developing nations. There's a series of very, very different people. And I paint that picture because that's really the role that corporate affairs directors are here to try and help organizations decode. It's a very, very complicated picture, and the world of climate action is noisy. It's very principled in lots of places. People come with extreme views on every single aspect of climate action, and trying to make sense of that and forge a path for organizations, I think is now more complex than ever before. 70,000 people, I think, are due to be in Dubai at this COP, which is double what the last COP was. So complexity, hyper complexity. And in that world, the role of corporate affairs directors is to try and put together some form of stakeholder, active and rapidly active stakeholder engagement plan. Now, doing that in normal circumstances is hard enough, but doing it when everyone is yelling at you, everyone is trying to take a position on everything, and everyone's demanding that you act on everything yesterday, is even more complicated. And this role of decoding that falls to the corporate affairs director. So I just paint that picture because we live in this world of hyper complexity when it comes to corporate affairs. And in that respect, I think that there are these two fundamental roles for corporate affairs directors today. We've talked a lot at the Corporate Affairs Academy in the last couple of years around this idea of corporate affairs as a decoding function. It's the only function, if you think of the executive functions in a business, it's the only function that starts from the outside and puts what's on the outside inside. Every other main function works from the inside out. We're an outside in function. And in a world where there's so much going on, so much happening around you in the climate world, trying to understand and listen to that world and having the skill set to decode what's being said, draw some conclusions about what's relevant for you and not relevant for others. These are highly complex and skilled roles, and that's really the first role for corporate affairs directors. I'm conscious that I'm surrounded by very expert corporate affairs directors here, who feel free to disagree, by the way. The second thing, which I think is really important today, is the ability for corporate affairs directors to play nice with the other functions in the business. Again, something that many of you will have heard me talk a bit about, I've written a bit about, is this idea that really good modern corporate affairs sees itself as a Pentium chip function. This idea that it partners and enables all the other functions, roles and chiefs inside the business, is a smart place for corporate affairs directors to be. But in a world like we have today, with this hyper complex environment, it's even more important than ever for two reasons. Number one is that if you're going to try and understand the different perspectives of the different parts of the business, what's relevant in this melee of noise, you've got to have really strong relationships with all the divisions, all the functions inside the business, because there will be some things that are not relevant for you, but are very noisy from the outside world. And having the confidence to say that's not our fight or not our particular bag is a really important corporate affairs weapon or tool. And the second thing is, when you're thinking about then what to do about climate action, so coming up with climate strategies, corporate affairs directors play a vital role in trying to navigate with their department heads and the functional heads what's important, because otherwise policy gets made without corporate affairs intervention. And so corporate affairs plays a role through those divisions and through the strategy players. So that's my two pennies worth on why it's super complex and why corporate affairs directors should be paid a lot more money than they are currently being paid. You see, I'm just trying to buy favour with my two colleagues.
Thank you for that.
Good advocacy, Rupert. Thank you. That's a great overview. I love that idea of corporate affairs directors as decoders and Pentium trips. That's like, makes us sound like we're all about to join the Marvel assemble, but that's brilliant. Thank you. Chris, if I could come to you now, can you highlight some of the research that GlobeScan have been doing in the corporate affairs space that backs up some of Rupert's points?
Sure, Maya. Yeah, so Rupert and I and his team and my team have been working on this corporate affairs survey for a number of years now, and we survey corporate affairs directors across the world. So it's very global and very regional and comes from all different sectors. And this esteemed group of people give really useful feedback.
It's phenomenal feedback.
Amazing, yeah. And for instance, and this is part of why is climate and COP so central now to the corporate affairs discussions, where historically it's been very sustainability oriented and the sustainability function, but now it's moved into a different place. When we surveyed these corporate affairs directors across the world, they identified climate change as both one of the top 2 risks facing their business and one of the top 2 opportunities facing their business. Now that's rare where you have an issue like that that's on both of these camps, which makes it central to how do you protect value for the organization? How do you create value for the organization, which is exciting. We also found that in the context of advocacy and how companies may project and play a role in systemic change and influence policy and things like that, while there's still a minority of companies that are really keen to truly dive into advocacy, it's about 3 in 10 that say so now, which is up 10 points over a couple of years, so it's increasing. But in that group that's quite committed, climate is the most important topic for them to advocate around. So it's very germane to what they're trying to express and shape in the broader economic system, which makes sense because it's both a big risk and a big opportunity, and therefore influencing and shaping that is really fundamental. However, some of the dampening we have to recognize is that there's also growing anxiety among corporate affairs directors and heads of comms around greenwashing. And they are concerned and anxious about being accused of greenwashing. 66% of corporate affairs directors now indicate concern around that. That's up significantly in the last year, in fact. So we have to be attentive to that. We have to be sensitive. We've got to have a very performance-first approach and leading our communications and engagement from a strength of performance and not be cut out because there's significant reputational risk in that context. The last thing I'll add, just to build on Rupert's both decode and I was thinking a second D of diplomacy and corporate diplomacy and all those skills required. There's an anecdote a couple of days ago that I stumbled in one of these hubs and stumbled upon a conversation around climate financing, something I know very little about, but I was interested in it. And I met these 4 indigenous leaders from Peru and Ecuador, and these and 2 are chiefs of their tribes or nations in Ecuador and Peru. And together they are stewards of 14 million hectares of jungle, critical biodiverse rich areas. And I was asking Juan, the chief from Ecuador, and his English was fantastic. I'm like, what, I know why you're here at COP, but what are you doing at this climate financing conversation specifically? And he said it's climate financing and we need financing to protect the climate. It was like very simple. And then I watched the panel of bankers and private equity managers and insurance companies, using very complex language. And the decoding piece was, we need probably 2 layers of decoding to connect on the ground people who need the resources and have trusted approaches and those who are actually making the climate decisions. And I think there's a lot of gaps to fill between those 2 worlds as we progress down this road.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really interesting overview. 66% of corporate affairs directors are now concerned about greenwashing. Well, we'll come back to that topic later, obviously really pertinent while you're all out there in Dubai. Chris, I wanted to ask you, what's your view on how, you talked a little bit about how where climate sits within an organization has moved from sustainability to the broader corporate affairs function. What's your view on how the role of and contribution of comms and corporate teams has evolved since early CSR, maybe 20 years ago, to the broader church of sustainability communications today?
Yeah, I think historically there was The sustainability function, I think, was a very fun function to be a part of a while ago, because you were left to your own devices. And in some ways that was really disturbing, because you weren't part of the heart of the enterprise or strategy, and 15, 20 years ago. But it's moved into a much more strategic place, and that has required more collaboration across these functions. So the communications connection to the sustainability strategy and performance has become a really important differentiator for companies. I think companies who do that well, they differentiate well, they execute externally well, and they're given recognition and have influence and stronger reputations for it. It's not ubiquitous. There are many companies that have friction between these two functions and haven't joined up as effectively as they should. So I think it's a really important piece, not only to do the bread and butter of communicating more effectively and building brand and reputation, but also actually to execute on true leadership, and how do we actually connect the dots between what we can do internally, and what is the outside world, and how do people understand and recognize it.
If I could just add, I don't want to throw you off, Maya, but I think, speaking as somebody who's in the sustainability function, and just recently within 3M, our function being moved into, we call it public affairs or corporate affairs,
Yeah.
and bringing communications and sustainability like within the organization physically closer to drive that collaboration. And what I've found specifically to both your points from a decoding is, we're coming through the lens of very specific stakeholders, raters and rankers, investors, sustainability, NGOs, and that decoding of, well, how does this actually get to the broader population of stakeholders? How does it get to our customers? How does it get to general population who might be interested in the brand, or our consumers of our products, and that sort of thing? And so, but it's been a balance, because there are nuances. We still need to speak to those very niche stakeholders, because they're going to put a ranking, or they're going to, make a choice about investment. But at the same time, we have to get to that more simplified conversation as well, so that people are understanding. So I just wanted to throw that in, because I think coming from the side of how do we bring it together, and we're living it day to day.
Maybe just to stay on that topic, Maya, and sorry, for kind of doing a little bit of a deep dive on this, but I think we are touching base on a couple of interesting and important topics. I think, very often you would see organizations making that separation between corporate affairs and public affairs and communication, right? But, it's important to underline that obviously these two functions are obviously intertwined with each other. So on the one hand, we have the stakeholder engagement piece, which is partnership development, strengthening of alliances. And then obviously on the comm side, you have, that activation piece, that outreach piece, that amplification piece. So I think, as corporate affairs animals, even, if you work within an organization who makes that, functional separation, it's important to understand, holistically, and to claim your seat at the table from the very beginning. And we do very often see within communications that, that function comes in at the last stakeholder to a project, when everything is already established. The way I look at it, when you have the opportunity to be within, so to speak, that conversation from the very beginning, you come in as a strategic counselor and advisor, because you can give a perspective on, in terms of engaging with public discourse, might generate, the best action, and then obviously having a very clear understanding on the target audience you engage with. I always say, as communicators, as public affairs professionals, that's the first question we need to ask ourselves: who are we talking to? Because only that is going to inform our engagement strategies, our channel strategies, our format strategies, our tonality, our sentiment, right?
I really like your description of corporate affairs communications as an activation mechanism.
Yeah.
I think that's really nice. It captures what you need, and it actually plays into this idea of apprenticeship, actually, because without that, if you're on the finance function or the HR function, legal function, you're just doing stuff, but the activation of it comes when you communicate what you're doing to others, and that's that partnership. So I really like the phrasing that you used. Thank you. It's a gift. which I'm now going to nick.
Thank you, guys. Everyone's learning today. Amanda, you spoke a bit there about your role, your slightly different role, because you're fully focused on global sustainability at 3M. Can you expand a bit on the importance of collaboration between all those functions and where you see that going in the future, kind of from this point on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm coming through, I'm developing the strategies often around our goals and our perspectives. Part of my role is also engagement, both in partnerships, being at events like COP, but engagement within the organization as well to make sure that that story is being told. And within, 3M, we had historically been, separate. I was under R&D up until 6 months ago. So very different coming together with our communications team. But I think what we found is as the topic of sustainability becomes integrated into the purpose of the company, and it just it's no longer an individual sustainability conversation. It has to be a brand conversation. It has to be a company conversation. And the comms team would, rightfully so, be telling the story of the company and maybe making decisions that not misalign to the strategy, but maybe not pulling forward some of the nuance of our strategy. And so I'm really excited about the idea that we're now one team and we're collaborating very closely, to your point of, early in the strategy as we look to update goals or we look to reframe our frameworks, the combination of sustainability and communications together as a team and that development is going to be really critical to making sure that it's being translated appropriately, that we're thinking about the larger set of target audiences. And I think in the future, my hope for us, and I think the need, is to just be fully integrated. That's where we'll see the magic happen, and we'll make sure that both from a strategic perspective, but also from a communications and storytelling perspective, that we are pushing in the ways that we should.
And just expanding on that point about storytelling, Amanda, do you think that form of collaboration and working more closely together is going to really help to engage broader audiences and stakeholders and move kind of the doom and gloom narrative, if you like, to motivate individuals, corporates and governments to action and behavior change?
I do, because it's easy in the climate space to go quickly to the dark and to talk about how we're not moving fast enough and there's still issues. But when you think about the broader stakeholder audience, oftentimes that feeling of, well, my own personal action is not going to do anything. It's such a huge issue. And how do we connect with those and in a sort of the functional, the emotional, the social benefits of taking action? And I think having professional storytellers help us change that narrative to not be focused on the negative, but be focused on the positive and what companies are doing and how we're making progress and how each individual can join us on that journey by the choices they make or the products they use or the choices they make in their home. I think that will make a difference. I think in communication with communicators with government affairs and talking about how we're bringing together our advocacy, I think there's an element that we maybe need to do more of in how we frame that narrative when we're advocating for policy is going to make a difference. So I think there's a lot more to do. I think it will make a difference in how we move forward.
Storytelling.
Sorry, Rupert.
I totally agree. Storytelling. It sometimes gets a bad rep, right? The people think of storytelling as being telling sort of either sort of inconsequential stories or PR guff. But storytelling or superficial, even better. And I mean, storytelling has been the glue that has driven human progress for millennia. It's storytelling that differentiates us from others in the animal kingdom. So the idea that storytelling doesn't play a part, it seems extraordinary to me, because we are storytelling human beings. And I think that your point about positive stories has got to be right. I've noticed we were talking about this yesterday in the green room, in the Microsoft Pavilion, I think, and the positive immediate short-term stories of what we've done so far are so important to communicate, to tell stories around. Otherwise, you're right, we have no agency. We don't feel we can do anything. We feel that it's a terrible world and there's nothing that anyone can do. And that's just wrong. It's just wrong. So I think storytelling is absolutely vital. It's what makes us human, and the corporate affairs directors are the chief storytellers.
Yes.
Thanks, Rupert. Sammy, did you want to add to that about the spirit of collaboration moving forward with the different functions for to make corporate affairs more effective in the climate space?
Yeah, happy to do that, but maybe also to take a step back, Maya, and kind of a little bit touch base on the role of corporate affairs, communications, public affairs in the context, obviously, of the pivotal moment in which we are, which is COP28. And back to your point on hyper complexity, Maya, I think this COP is going to be, coming in at a critical juncture in time, as we are going to see for the first time since the Paris Agreement, where obviously the United Nations member state agreed to limit global warming to 1.5. We're going to see for the first time what is so-called the global stocktake. And that global stocktake, in short, GST, is going to obviously inform of where we stand as a global community. And we already know we are way off track. And you can see that also within the language being used to kind of, come to conclusions and negotiated outcomes who are going to translate into staying within reach of 1.5. Why is that? Because we already know, as scientific data shows us, we are off track. Very recently illustrated by the IPCC. So the GST is indeed an opportunity for course correction. Right, and not only evaluate where the global community stands, but also give a very clear assessment and recommendation on critical areas. I think, secondly, COP28 is an opportunity for organizations and stakeholders to engage, as we do see for the first time, critical topics being highly prominent on the agenda, such as loss and damage, food systems, agriculture, land use, and health. Health for the first time. This is 28 years in climate negotiation, and health is only coming in now. We've seen in the first days of COP already declarations on loss and damage, operationalizing that fund, which was agreed at COP27. We have seen declarations on food. We have seen declarations on health and many other impulses, which has been said. Obviously, this is not what's going to be, it's important to set these impulses now to inform and entertain, obviously, the negotiation process. Because at the end of this COP, there's going to be a declaration which needs to be agreed by all United Nations member states, right? So for me, and particularly for the company we work for, we are very much looking forward from an on-ground engagement perspective to kind of engage on these topics, be it regenerative agriculture, food systems, food security. How does climate change impact health? For example, cardiovascular diseases. How does it impact a smallholder farmer if climate change is leading to a decrease of yields from a overall perspective? And then obviously also looking into the critical topic of climate-induced hunger. Obviously, less yields means we are going to have issues. Obviously, also providing enough food for the global community. I think, Chris, you also made a good point. When you said, look, as part of so to speak, the scope for corporate affairs professional and the kind of findings you had within that survey, kind of playing nice. I think, yeah. But then, playing nice in a way and saying, hey, we need to come in from an early stage, as I said just a moment ago, to kind of, support on strategic, outreach and amplification efforts. I think I want to advocate a little bit for not doing too much of a cheerleading communications, which is, having a delegation on ground and then, obviously, pictures are being taken, leave that to the executives. They have their own channels. But I think when we look at, how to amplify our messaging around, so to speak, that value proposition as an organization, which sits as at a system-relevant interjunction of health and nutrition, we kind of try to, very much take a look at what are the key moments throughout this thematic program. of COP28, and how can we, incorporate through storytelling, through, putting certain emphasis on certain topics which are critical to us, forward again via different channels. I hope I answered your question. I know I've been a little bit elaborative on that.
Can I build on what you're saying, Sammy?
Sure.
Like, that's so true. So we all agree storytelling and communications are indispensable. We need to motivate, mobilize, educate, all that stuff. A lot of work to be done anyways. The tone of how we do it, like you were mentioning, Sammy, is really important because we do know the general, like I think there's a bunch of transitional plays. There's a technological transitional play, there's an innovation tech transitional play. There's a regulatory policy transitional play, and then there's a societal transitional play. All four of those or five of those have to move simultaneously. If one of them doesn't move, the whole thing stops. And I think on the societal piece, we've got a lot of work to do where we need to mobilize and get the world moving together, which is part of this just transition framework. And I do think that in our global public opinion work in August, we saw now 42% of the world feel the impacts of climate change. And the anxiety related to that is quite profound. We know that 94% of the world thinks the energy transition is needed, only 6% doesn't. That 6% is highly distributed in the G7 countries. 19% of Americans don't think it's needed. So the friction is stuck in the old world or the North in many ways. Yet we also know that people are at this stage of, okay, the transition is happening, but how's it happening? Who's it benefiting? Who's winning? Who's losing? Where do I fit into it? And I think the massive disruption we're feeling as a society across many different pillars leads us to greater insecurity in the world. And so I think our job as communicators is to be honest, to feel people's anxiety, to tell the truth, obviously, of how far behind, how much work we have to do, but then also create ability to showcase this pathway as one that drives broader security for society as well as solve climate change.
Just to add to that, though, I mean, I think when we think about all these different audiences, and it's easy from a corporate perspective to get caught in sort of global messaging, and it is just so clear, particularly in this COP, that one message or one size does not fit all, and that you have to understand, whether it's North versus South, whether it's old versus young, particularly that. I mean, you just think about the youth that are being so active here, and they're coming from a perspective of, I have a lifetime to live. Whereas maybe that 90%, I don't know what the demographic data was behind that, but maybe one could guess that maybe it's older generations who are not, have a shorter term view. And so how are you messaging to the different audiences to be able to speak to them in a way that is relevant and that is going to resonate and bring them along, because they may be thinking, what is my role in this? And we need to understand where they're coming from.
Thank you, guys. I'm listening to you all. It's clear that Rupert's initial assessment of complexity isn't something that is, it's not stagnant, it's increasing complexity, right? Sammy, to your point, we're seeing healthcare come on the agenda at COP for the first time in the climate context. We've got the whole atmosphere of corporate activism, political populism. There's a real tension there, as you said, Chris, between navigating these increasingly complex climate conversations while also being advocates for that just transition. How do you navigate that tension? Who wants to pick that one up?
It's one of these two, because they're in the driving seats of this.
Maybe I just give it. Yeah. Thank you, Rupert. Maybe I might just give it a go, and then let's build on that. I think three keywords on that: transparency, stakeholder engagement, and alignment with values. And this is back to your point, how to incorporate sustainability, climate change as part of your core strategy as an organization. So on transparency, obviously there's a communication piece and there's a broader piece, and how you communicate, back to our conversation at Oxford, Rupert, ESG, what is the governance piece of that? How we are basically, making transparent whatever pledges an organization has committed to, be it net zero targets, be it other sustainability targets, such as, for Bayer, we kind of pledged for, to just flash out one, provide 100 million farmers with access to tools, to know-how and expertise in low and middle income countries, because we know they are part of the equation as well. And we know, agriculture is also part of the problem. Agriculture contributes with 30% to global greenhouse gas emissions, and this is both CO2 and methane, right? And we do have innovation taking place in that space in order to, as I said, kind of build in regenerative agricultural practices into our business operations. On the second piece, stakeholder engagement, I think, we are very often engaging in very charged and tense public discourses with different stakeholder groups. And I think to kind of, it's not always easy to follow an evidence and science-based dialogue because these topics are so, they are what they are. And very often you deal with stakeholders who have a very clear intention to paint a black and white picture. But I think nevertheless, it's important to seek that dialogue, particularly, with communities such as youth, indigenous people, and kind of come together and then create platforms where you can exchange thoughts and ideas. And if you don't always need to agree, but at least opening that door for dialogue. And then secondly, on that value piece, I think it's important as an organization to have a very clear set of values which respond to mega trends, which respond to critical issues of our time. And if you don't have them, you're doing you might need to, do a little bit of groundwork on that. But I think also sometimes we overcomplicate our messaging in that regard. So I think simplicity in that respect, and again, having the first question you ask yourself, who's your target audience, having on top of mind who you are talking to and how you're engaging basically with critical stakeholders in this regard.
I would almost just say ditto for simplicity. I would just echo the clarity, transparency, authenticity. I think in this world of greenwashing, but even before, I think consumers, customers, they're very savvy, and they can see when you're not being true to who you are as a brand. And I think particularly in this space, and particularly because of the greenwashing concerns, just being true to what you can be truthful about, and being as open as you can be without trade secrets or something else coming into play, that you want to be able to do that. And I think regulations are pushing us in that direction, but I think where we can voluntarily, own our own narrative and be ahead and in front of what regulations are requiring, I think that's where truth and sort of honesty about it really comes to play.
Can I add I think this leads us right smack into the question of organizational purpose. Because as you both speak to the idea of the truth of the situation and being able to speak authentically about what matters to you as an organization, that underlines, to my mind, the requirement to go back to the fundamental question, not about what you do and the ESG and the commitments that you're making. A very important step before that is to ask the question, well, what is in our wheelhouse? Why are we here as an organization? And as a result of that analysis, you'll be clear about what you do and what you don't do as an organization. I mean, lots of people, when they come to me about the purpose debate, they say, well, can you help us with the purpose? And the first question I always ask is, what does your purpose stop you from doing? Because most purpose statements try to enable you to do everything. But that's normally a recipe for risk and crisis. The biggest corporate crises have normally come from parts of organizations where the organization should never have been in the first place. And so I think this nicely leads back into the question of re-looking at corporate purpose. In that respect, what I've observed, I chair something called the Enacting Purpose Initiative at Oxford. It's Oxford, the British Academy, the University of California at Berkeley, Boston Consulting Group, and Federated Hermes. So a multi-institution partnership. And we've started to look at this question of why purpose matters. And the most startling kind of initial observation, is that many organizations haven't looked at their purpose for years, decades sometimes, because why bother? It's just, they just carry on doing what they think they should be doing. And I think when we tack that point onto hypercomplexity and climate action, the only way that you can decode what's relevant for you is to make sure you're clear about where your boundaries are. Otherwise, you chase the mercury ball on the latest issue, or fad, or theme, or problematic set of questions that emerges from something like COP, and you chase it, and you'll never get yourself into a position where you can communicate authentically. You'll put yourself in a mess about trying to make comments on things that you shouldn't be commenting on. So I think it's a really important moment for purpose. No purpose is back, but if there's anything that climate action tells us, is that it's back, and it should be back with far greater power than it currently is within boardrooms.
I'm interested. I mean, purpose is something we talk about PRovoke the whole time, and it's very much, it's a dominant issue, not just across climate and sustainability, but across, license to operate in general. But one of the things I haven't heard anyone say is that we talked about transparency, is the notion of trust. I mean, corporates are concerned about greenwashing because the perception is that corporates are greenwashing. How do you move forward when we're operating or trying, even if it's authentically and with purpose, to move forward on climate commitments and actually making a difference in the world, and overcome that distrust by multiple stakeholders that you're doing things for the right reason? Because you can't do that just with good storytelling alone. It doesn't matter how transparent you are, there's going to be people who still don't believe you. And how do you move forward, like, from greenwashing?
I think we should start with Chris on some facts, because actually there's some quite good research, and then you two can get at it. But I think let's start with some of the research, because Globescan's done some really interesting stuff on trust.
Yeah, and it's not all negative, so it's good. There's a positive thing. So trust in institutions, we've been tracking for 23 years now with the general public to operate in the best interest of society. And global companies are trusted lower than a few others, but there's an improvement, much higher than government. Well behind all these, behind two important institutional players on the trust ecosystem: scientists and academics. So in a good place, very highly trusted, and true across the world. Every region, every demographic, people, regardless of the conversations we've had of populism, fake news, and anti-elitism, people trust science and academics. That's a mast we can hold on to. NGOs are also highly trusted. So the challenge we have, I think, in this sort of communication challenge is first of all, perform. I mean, performance is king and queen going forward, and in a transparent world, we have to perform, and that's the basis of it. Secondly, to try and shorten the curve of people seeing performance over time, it is definitely to work together in collaboration with a range of stakeholders, not just government and business alone. That's not the ideal trust equation. Throw in a few NGOs and a few academics, and then you've got a place that people can rest assured that something positive is happening. There's two other interesting statistics, and it's amazing how sophisticated we are as people, even if we're a layperson not focused on this issue. But two stats in this latest global public opinion poll. It's 30 countries, so it's quite global. One is that 87% of the world agrees that companies should encourage their governments to address climate change. So the advocacy piece, people understand that that's a good thing, the role for companies, despite low trust in business. Secondly, 77% of people across the world think governments should regulate companies to be better. That's up 32 points in 20 years. A very consistent curve.
Which indicates that companies aren't trustworthy.
Right.
Because why would you regulate?
So both of these low trust institutions, the public is saying, both of you guys got to sort this out and work together. There's a reinforcing mechanism they see. So it is about more the merrier to a degree in trying to improve trust.
But maybe I just add, and from scientists, I feel comfortable. We have a lot of scientists and at 3M, and we are driving, but I think it speaks to science behind your action. You talked about, performance. I think being transparent and specific about your progress so that there is clarity that the commitment you've made is actually, there's action being taken. But having and being transparent, going back to that, around what your path is, what is the math, what is the science behind the steps that you're taking, and I think that's where we're missing a lot. There's talk about regulations requiring climate transition plans, which is a step further than just an annual sustainability report or an impact report, and actually being able to articulate not only historical but future forward and where that's going. I think that's part of where we're all headed. And I would just also add to your collaboration piece. I think sort of the work that you're doing with NGOs, with organizations, those their meaningful endorsement of the work you're doing. Even you think about the explosion of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and a couple of years ago it was maybe 1,000 companies. I think I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's somewhere heading into 4,000 to 6,000 now. There's companies are getting on board at a very steep rate, and I think it's having those connections that's showing. But even that, SBTI, you have people getting removed from that because they aren't, they've made a commitment, but they're not taking the action. So for us, I think we really see the continued communication of progress. Certainly annually, we're trying to move to that, sort of more real-time data sharing as well. That'll be kind of our future next step, and getting to that point where any customer, any consumer, any person could go on the website and see, where are they? Yeah, exactly. And we're not there yet. I'll be the first to admit, but that's where we're headed.
Yeah, maybe just that I echo everything which has been said by Amanda, Chris. Again, I think you cannot ask anyone to trust you. You need to earn that trust, right? And also back to your golden circle of communication. People don't buy what you do; they buy why you do it. So I think whenever you have certain commitments being paid out, it's important to drive that forward with tangible credibility behind that. And how you're going to get to that level of credibility communications on what you have committed to is actually what type of alliances, what type of forward, and how you then engage with these you obviously serve. Maybe just a very recent example, and Rupert, you and I, we just talked about it. So yesterday, we just to give a little bit more kind of a tangible kind of perspective. We at Bayer announced a partnership with a company here in the UAE, where we are going to embark on a journey and test seed varieties in the middle of the desert to understand how these crops are performing, and to help us to how climate change might have an impact as part of an ecosystem approach in other parts of the world, which might see certain impacts due to just in 10 years from now. India, US, South America, and this goes back to my point. Having a seat at the table from the very beginning in order to support who are the stakeholders, how we can connect public sector, private sector partnerships, how we can into really understanding local, regional, global dynamics and translate that into concrete actions.
There's a nice point that you make actually about intent here, because trust and the idea of earned trust relies a lot on understanding the intent behind any action. For those of you who are interested in this, there's a sort of seminal trust paper in 1995 written by Davis and Shulman. I'll put it in the it's a 95 paper, and it identifies three things that are drivers of trust, which are ability, benevolence, and integrity. So the ability speaks to your science, it's to the capabilities. The benevolence speaks to the intent, and the integrity speaks to your character. And I think it's a really nice frame. And I totally agree. It's trust, it's earned trust, not companies or organizations demanding that they are trusted.
Well, and just to underline, you mentioned it as well, and goes along with that, is the timelines to this. You can't speed up trust building. It has to be built over time, and you have to take the time to understand and have a two-way dialogue. And we're doing this with communities. You mentioned communities, and through things like environmental justice and understanding with Indigenous or First Nations, in areas of Canada and in forestry. I mean, these are things that take years. And I know we're on a sped up timeline, Teresa's, but
it not only takes years, it's iterative.
Right, exactly.
Because as soon as you deliver on one promise, the expectation is you're going to deliver on the next. Right. And so it's a constant process of earned trust. And and again, coming back to the theme of this panel, there's only one function that understands how to do continual stakeholder engagement, and that's corporate affairs.
Just moving us back to where we are in Dubai at COP28 and the greenwashing question, there's an awful lot of activity, as you said, going on. Is some activity at COP28 that you've seen greenwashing, do you think? I mean, what is meaningful dialogue at the event?
Well, I'll kick off to say that I think that you have to allow there to be a certain amount of pride from the host country. You've got to allow for organizations to want to showcase their very best side. So in some senses, greenwashing really is a part of what you see all around you, because everyone is trying to put forward their best foot. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think when it becomes a bad thing is when there are active intent behind the greenwashing to either hide, obscure, or deflect. And that's where you have problematic commitments being made or statements being made.
And then, I mean, let's keep also top of mind what COP is. It's a conference of the party, and the host country has the responsibility to, ensure that there's a platform to convene and build bridges. So I think, and I said that just a moment ago, the kind of impulses which were put forward in the first days of COP, and always having difficulties with that word, operationalization of a loss and damage fund, commitments, declarations on food, on health, and many other things, I think are going to, hopefully inform and entertain the negotiation process to come to, outcomes which are going to be agreed by all United Nations member states. And I think that's critical. And that's, again, from my perspective, the responsibility of a host country as well.
I'm just going to build on, I agree with what Sammy was saying. And I think I'm more concerned about greenwashing than greenwashing, to be frank. I think we're all very good at picking out greenwashing, and we can make our decisions and our assessments that way. I think the greenwashing is dangerous from many fronts, but we're talking about a multi-stakeholder ecosystem that's quite fragile and increasingly anxious and emotionally responding to the crisis as it becomes much more tangible. And I think when companies are quiet, they assume the worst, especially in a low trust vacuum. And so we need to be very conscious of when we are too careful. The interpretation is people don't believe what they don't understand that we get the problem and we're part of the solution. So being proactive is really important.
I've got a question from our audience today that I'd like to ask you. But first of all, can you just all very briefly, what are your personal takeaways from your experience at COP28 and what you're actually going to take back into your business, organization and role? Rupa, I'll start with you.
There is a real energy around a very wide agenda. I was very unprepared for just how broad the agenda has become. And I think it presents a huge challenge for people in research to try and connect the dots. So for me, it's about understanding the breadth of the agenda, but trying to find the connections between the different kind of silos that are springing up.
Plenty of food for thought. Sammy, what about you?
Yeah, I think, being very mindful from the very beginning around the thematic program and how does this thematic program resonates with your organization's value proposition and equation. And then what we are doing within our organization, we have months and months of prep work on that. We are sitting in project teams, both on a public affairs, corporate affairs level, together with our sustainability colleagues, and then obviously with our communication colleagues to really strategically think, how can we engage, how can we amplify, but most importantly, how can we leave an impact? And I think that's going to need to be the first question. Private sector has a role to play in that whole discourse and engagement moving forward. And I think particularly when you work at a system relevant intersection, you need to be mindful with respect to the types of stakeholders you engage and what you are driving forward as an organization.
Okay, thank you. Amanda.
I think what I'm really most excited to see is just a tremendous expansion of the focus on just transition. Last year in Sharm, I remember walking through the pavilions and taking a snapshot of this tiny little pavilion that was the Just Transition Pavilion and saying, oh, how great that it's finally here in this tiny little space. And now it's just pervasive in the dialogue. And I think, and an expanding of the definition. I think when we first started talking about just transition, it was really focused on the energy transition and how we're bringing workers along, and now it's about communities and diversity and inclusion, and it's about people and the recognition. We talked about this in the session with GlobeScan a couple of days ago, was that you cannot solve for the environment and the planet without bringing, keeping people front of mind and keeping society front of mind. They are absolutely intertwined, the social and the environmental. We talk about sustainability, that is it. And so that has to, I'm really thrilled that is a much bigger conversation here this year at COP. And I think that will motivate all companies, NGOs, et cetera, to keep that very front of mind as we move forward.
I think it's very prescient. 3M's sustainability strategy is predicated on the third pillar on people, and right from the beginning, which was a little bit rare. So that now it's come full circle.
Yeah,
full circle. I think, I agree with everyone said. I think this idea of we're finally getting our hands around the full complexity, the integration across this agenda, the health piece and the food piece is very exciting and relevant because everyone cares about health and food. I think the nature agenda is also something that's growing importantly in these conversations. That's exciting. And I think nature is one of the gifts that, while it's so obvious, of course, nature matters. It hasn't been part of the dialogue or the corporate dialogue in particular, but nature allows us to talk about this sometimes with a fresh set of eyes. And I think the very simple fact of the climate conversation and decarbonization in particular is very much based on let's avoid the apocalypse. Let's do less bad so that we survive. And that can be motivating. It's motivating to a degree, but it gets to zero. And even the language of net zero neutrality gets to something there. On the nature agenda, there's infinite possibilities on how to make nature much more flourishing and positive. So there's an energy, even in the way we frame and talk about nature, that is more catalytic, I think, in its foundation than climate. So I think we can grab onto that a little bit more, and hopefully that engages people more quickly.
Thank you all so much. That's where we've actually run out of time for questions. That was such an engagement. I think we could probably roll on another hour quite easily, and you may well just stay in the room chatting for another hour. But
you go for 2 hours.
Another 2 hours. Somebody get them coffee. It's time for us to close, but thank you all so much, Rupert, Chris, Amanda, and Sammy, and the teams as well who've helped to organise this conversation for your time and your expertise. On behalf of PRovoke and APACD, thanks everyone for attending today. I think we've demonstrated quite comprehensively that corporate affairs directors really do need knowledge, purpose, action, and to go out and do that decoding and Pentium chipping as we collectively address the climate crisis as it evolves in complexity week by week. If you were here at the start of the session, you might have seen our opening slide. We're going to show that again at the end. It's got a QR code on it. I think it's coming on now. You can download some of the research referenced today, loads of other resources. So do have a look at that QR code.